Okay.
So how old were you in the 60s?
How old was I in the 60s?
Yeah. Like 65, how old were you?
65, I was 35.
All
Is that
right.
right? 35? I was 25.
25. 60.
Tell me about myself in the 1960s. Okay, I was in the beginning of the 60s, I was in college, and then I joined the Navy, and I saw the world, and
Where
I
did you go to college?
got married. I went to college at the University of Illinois downstate.
What kind of music did you listen to?
I used to listen to classical music mostly,
Yeah.
and I was never very much interested in popular music. Rock and roll was just starting, and I never liked rock and roll. So music was not a big part of my life.
Where did you live?
Where did I live? I lived in Champaign, Urbana, and then I moved to, then I joined the Navy, and I was in Rhode Island for 6 months. And I came back and got married. So I was in Rhode Island for about a year. Half of it without tutu and the other half with tutu. And then we drove from Newport, Rhode Island to California, and we rode on, and we knew we were on our way to Hawaii. After Hawaii, we moved back to Chicago.
Anywhere you were, was there anything, because there were a lot of like movements going on at that time. Do you remember anything specifically, or were you?
Ban the bra.
Yeah.
I remember that. Women were taking off their bras, and it was great.
The Ban the Bra movement that my grandfather was referring to was a women's liberation demonstration at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City. These women claimed that the Miss American pageant was very sexist and paraded women around like cattle. A small group of these women brought tickets to the event and unfurled a banner reading Women's Liberation and threw stink bombs into the main seating area of the event. The Ban the Bra part on the boardwalk of Atlantic City, women threw objects of female oppression, like bras, girdles, corsets, heels, and other things, into a trash can and supposedly burned them, but according to many sources, that part was a myth. Many women who were a part of this movement or supported what they believed in also stopped wearing or using these objects of oppression, hence the name Ban the Bra. While this movement was very interesting to learn about, it really surprised me that this was the one that really stood out in my grandfather's mind as a major movement in the 1960s. When I think about the 1960s, I think more along the lines of racial protests or war protests rather than things like Ban the Bra against the Miss America pageant.
Um, there were movements about discrimination, black discrimination against blacks
Yeah.
in the 60s. There were, but it wasn't nearly as active as it is today.
It really surprised me to hear my grandfather say that the racial riots in the 1960s were not nearly as intense as they are today, especially living in Chicago where so many racial riots were happening, like the 1968 Chicago riots, which were sparked by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. There was severe damage to the city and lots of violence. There was more than 48 hours of rioting. There were 11 people dead, 48 people wounded, 90 policemen injured, and 2,150 people were arrested. 2 miles of Chicago were left in rubble because of the riots, looting, and fires. 10,500 police were sent in, along with National Guard troops and 5,000 Army troops. There were also the Division Street riots in Chicago, which started at the first downtown Puerto Rican parade. when a policeman shot a young Puerto Rican man and riots broke out. It was also caused by the rising tension between the Puerto Rican population because of their displacement, because of their poverty and discrimination, all in Chicago. This helped to form many of the Puerto Rican community organizations, as well as organizations for Hispanic people in general in Chicago. For me, it was really surprising that the racial riots weren't a big part of my grandfather's memory of the 1960s, of when he lived in Chicago, because when I think of the 1960s, it's all about racial riots and all about racial protests and all about the civil rights movement. So it came as a surprise to me that it wasn't about that for him.
Protests against the Vietnam War. Did you know anybody who's involved in those or know about it when you
Me,
were?
I was in Vietnam.
Yeah, but there were people who were like super against the war.
Yeah,
like all the
but
people who were like,
that happened, that was more in the 70s.
yeah.
Yeah, that kind of gained momentum in the 70s. Um,
The fact that my grandfather wasn't really aware of the Vietnam War protests until the 1970s kind of surprised me because of his involvement in the war and because of how many there were in places that he lived, especially in Chicago. In 1966, the National Coordinating Committee to End the War in Vietnam had major demonstrations in Chicago. At the Democratic National Convention in 1968, when he definitely was living in Chicago, there was a major protest full of violence and looting, and they tried to nominate a pig for president. There was destruction throughout the entire week of the convention. There were also the days of rage in everywhere, including Chicago in 1969, where they were trying to bring the war home, rioting and looting and destruction by the Weatherman Group, which was an American radical left wing organization. The fact that he really did not know that these things were going on, or at least they didn't affect him at all, was kind of surprising to me because of his involvement in the war.
Was there anything that happened like in the news that you remember, like that stands out to you, or was it all just?
in the news,
Yeah, like things not
Yeah.
necessarily where you were living.
the Vietnam War
Yeah.
was in the news a lot. Um, what else? I guess not much.
Yeah.
Looking back at it, I don't remember a big, huge news story that stands out that I paid any attention to.
I have to say, I am a little bit surprised that no major news stories come to the mind of my grandpa. I know it could just be from memory loss, from getting older, but I feel like there were a lot of major events that happened in the 1960s that he probably should have been remembering. Overall, it was an interesting interview, and I feel like I got an insight into the minds of a man who wasn't really all that affected by all of the big things that we see happening in the 1960s through the eyes of history rather than through the eyes of actually living it.